In Truman Capote's world of fragile, high society swans, there was one woman he admired not for her delicacy, but for her strength, actress Patricia Neal. He didn't see a swan, he saw a thoroughbred. His admiration proved prophetic, as her life would become an unbelievable story of resilience, tested by a series of tragedies that would have broken anyone else. She was the Oscar winner, who would lose a child to a cruel illness, suffer catastrophic strokes at the peak of her fame that left her unable to walk or speak, and endure a heartbreaking betrayal by her husband, the writer Roald Dahl. Yet she fought her way back from the abyss, returning to the screen to deliver another Oscar-nominated performance. This is the story of the woman Capote knew was indestructible, the story of a survivor. To understand the steel at the core of Patricia Neal, you have to go back to a place as far from the bright lights of Broadway and the chic brownstones of Manhattan as one could possibly get, Packard, Kentucky. Born in 1926, Patsy Lou Neal was a child of the mountains, the daughter of a coal company manager. This was Appalachia in the heart of the Depression era, a world of deep, abiding faith, of back-breaking work, and of unshakable, often suffocating community bonds. Her Southern Baptist upbringing instilled in her a powerful, almost rigid sense of right and wrong, a down-to-earth pragmatism, and a suspicion of frivolity that she never entirely lost, even when she was draped in Hollywood furs and dripping with diamonds. Her family was not poor in the way many of their neighbors were. Her father's position afforded them a degree of comfort, but the specter of poverty and hardship was a constant presence, written on the tired faces of the miners and their families. It was a world where life was precarious and where a woman's future was almost invariably tied to the man she married. But from a very early age, Patsy Lou knew she wanted something different. She was gifted with a startling, extraordinary voice. It was not the light, girlish soprano of the other girls in the church choir. It was a deep, husky, resonant instrument, a voice that seemed to carry the ancient sorrows and strengths of the mountains themselves. When she spoke, people listened. She discovered early on that her voice, combined with a sharp intelligence and a gaze that could stop traffic, was a form of power. She came of age as America was clawing its way out of the Great Depression and plunging headfirst into the maelstrom of the Second World War. It was an era of profound transformation, where the rigid social structures of the past were beginning to crack. For a fiercely ambitious girl from coal country, the world beyond the Appalachian Mountains beckoned with an irresistible pull. She wasn't just dreaming of escape, she was meticulously planning it. With a focus that bordered on obsession, she excelled in drama, and her talent was so undeniable that she earned a scholarship to study at Northwestern University, a prestigious drama school near Chicago that was a breeding ground for future stars like Charlton Heston and Cloris Leachman. There, she shed the name Patsy Lou and became Patricia Neal. It was her first act of self-invention. After graduating, she did what all serious actors of her generation did. She bought a one-way ticket to New York City. She arrived in a post-war America that was brimming with a nervous, electric energy. It was a moment of artistic explosion. In the world of theater, the raw, emotional style of the method, championed by the actor's studio, was revolutionizing the craft of acting. Playwrights like Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller were holding a mirror up to the nation's fractured soul, writing complex, psychologically rich roles, especially for women. It was into this electrifying, fiercely competitive cauldron that Patricia Neal, the girl from Packard, threw herself. But it was also here, at the very moment of her greatest triumph, that she would be set on a collision course with a Hollywood legend, learning her first devastating lesson about the high price of fame and the treacherous nature of love. New York didn't just welcome Patricia Neal, it fell at her feet with a speed that was almost unheard of. After a brief period of understudying in 1946, at just 20 years old, she landed a leading role in the celebrated playwright Lillian Hellman's new play, Another Part of the Forest. It was a prequel to Hellman's hit The Little Foxes, and the part of the cunning, manipulative matriarch Regina Hubbard Giddens was notoriously difficult. Neal commanded the stage with a maturity, intelligence, and power that stunned audiences and critics alike. They had never seen anything like her. She was celebrated for her magnificent voice, her intelligent performances, and a statuesque, almost formidable beauty that was a world away from the delicate, kittenish starlets of the day. The performance won her the very first Tony Award ever given for a featured actress in a play. She was an overnight sensation, the toast of the town, the brilliant new star of the Broadway stage. Hollywood, of course, came calling immediately. Warner Brothers signed her to a lucrative contract, and she was whisked away to California. Her first film was a modest success opposite a future President Ronald Reagan, but it was her second role, a role that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons, that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. The film was The Fountainhead, a grand, ambitious adaptation of Ayn Rand's controversial philosophical novel. Her co-star was one of the biggest and most beloved names in the entire world, Gary Cooper. He was 46 years old, she was just 21. He was a Hollywood immortal, the quiet, heroic, all-American symbol of integrity and masculinity. And he was very much married. The attraction between them was instantaneous, a firestorm that consumed them both. On screen, they played two fiercely individualistic characters, locked in a battle of wills and desire. Off-screen, the dynamic was far more complicated. For Neal, a young, emotionally inexperienced woman far from home, this was not just a dalliance with a movie star, it was an all-consuming epic love. Gary Cooper was her world. He showered her with affection and attention, and she believed with all the fierce, naive conviction of her 21 years that he would leave his wife, the prominent socialite Veronica "Rocky" Cooper, for her. For 3 long years, they conducted a passionate, dramatic, and increasingly open secret affair. Hollywood society, a town built on whispers and gossip, buzzed with the scandal. They were seen everywhere together, and the intensity of their connection was undeniable, but the romance was built on a dangerous fault line. Cooper was a man paralyzed by indecision, a characteristic that would define the entire affair. He was torn between his deep, genuine affection for Patricia and his obligations to his wife and his teenage daughter, Maria. The pressure from all sides mounted, and the situation grew toxic and cruel. At one point, during a party at the home of a mutual friend, Rocky Cooper reportedly saw Patricia across the room and spat at her, hissing, "You whore." In another, even more chilling encounter, Cooper's daughter, Maria, who understandably adored her father and saw Patricia as a threat, encountered Neal on the street and allegedly spat at her as well. The emotional turmoil was immense, but the true tragedy, the moment that would haunt Patricia Neal for the rest of her life, was yet to come. She became pregnant with Cooper's child. In her mind, this was the moment of truth, the event that would finally force him to choose to leave his unhappy marriage and start a new life with her and their baby. Instead, he was horrified. He panicked. In the rigidly moralistic world of the late 1940s, a world policed by the studios and their strict morality clauses, the scandal of a beloved married movie star having an illegitimate child with his young co-star would have been catastrophic. It would have destroyed his carefully curated public image as the quintessential American hero. Under immense unrelenting pressure from Cooper, and with the implicit threat of being blacklisted by the studio, a heartbroken and utterly isolated Patricia Neal was coerced into having a secret abortion. The procedure was grim, performed in a doctor's office in secret. In her searingly honest autobiography, As I Am, she would later describe the experience with raw, unsparing honesty. I had an abortion. Gary was the one who paid for it. If I had had that baby, I would not have been so lonely, and I would have had a piece of him for the rest of my life. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. The abortion shattered something inside her. The great epic love affair was over, poisoned by guilt, shame, and the bitter, devastating realization that she had been a pawn in a game she never stood a chance of winning. Not long after, Cooper ended the affair and returned to his wife. Patricia was left alone to pick up the pieces of her heart, haunted by what she had done and what she had lost. The scandal had tarnished her reputation. She was labeled a homewrecker, and the brilliant career that had started with such astonishing promise began to stall. She was left with a brutal lesson. In the kingdom of Hollywood, love was a dangerous commodity, and a woman's heart was often the first and most acceptable casualty. The affair with Gary Cooper taught her a brutal lesson. In the kingdom of Hollywood, love was a dangerous commodity, and a woman's heart was often the first and most acceptable casualty. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a ghost that would follow her for the rest of her days. After the Cooper affair, Neal threw herself into her work, but a deep sense of loneliness lingered. She was a star whose brilliance had been tarnished by scandal, a woman whose profound talent was now overshadowed by gossip. She was adrift, searching for an anchor in the storm of her early fame. Then, in 1951, she attended a dinner party hosted by the playwright Lillian Hellman, a gathering that would, without her knowing it, set the course for the rest of her life. There she was introduced to a man unlike anyone she had ever met. He was a towering, eccentric, and brilliantly witty British writer named Roald Dahl. At that point, Dahl was not the beloved, whimsical children's author the world would come to know. He was a writer of dark, macabre, and exquisitely crafted short stories for adults, tales that often ended with a shocking, cruel twist. His life had already been a novel in itself. He was a former Royal Air Force fighter pilot, a genuine war hero who had flown hurricanes in Greece and Syria and had survived a horrifying plane crash in the Libyan desert that left him with severe injuries and chronic pain. During the war, he had also served as a spy and diplomat in Washington, D.C., moving easily through the highest circles of power, charming senators, and seducing socialites. He was cynical, arrogant, fiercely opinionated, and possessed a razor-sharp intellect that could be both dazzling and terrifying. He was utterly unimpressed by Hollywood glamour. To him, Patricia wasn't just another movie star. She was a fascinating, intelligent woman with a profound sadness in her eyes. He saw the strength beneath her vulnerability, the thoroughbred quality that Capote had identified. He was drawn to her husky voice, her sharp mind, and her earthy, unpretentious Americanness. She, in turn, was both intimidated and captivated by him. He was not like the smooth, charming actor she knew. He was difficult, often abrasive, but he was also brilliant, funny, and utterly original. Their courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual sparring, long transatlantic letters, and surprising tenderness. He made her laugh, challenged her opinions, and offered her a vision of a world far away from the toxic hypocrisy of Hollywood. It was not a simple romance, it was a meeting of two powerful, complicated, and wounded people. In 1953, they were married. They bought a white, unassuming Georgian farmhouse called Great Gypsy House in the sleepy village of Great Missenden, Buckinghamshire. For the first time since leaving the mountains of Kentucky, Patricia Neal felt like she had a real home, a sanctuary. The next few years were a period of almost idyllic bohemian bliss. She embraced her new life as an English country wife and mother. She planted a magnificent garden, learned to cook, and became a beloved figure in the local village. She continued to work, choosing her roles carefully, often taking parts in acclaimed films like Elia Kazan's A Face in the Crowd, or the classic science fiction film The Day the Earth Stood Still, but her focus had fundamentally shifted. Her primary role was no longer movie star, but wife to a brilliant, burgeoning writer and mother to their growing family. Their first child, Olivia 20, was born in 1955, a beautiful girl who would become the apple of her father's eye. She was followed by Chantal Sophia, who they called Tessa, in 1957. Then, in 1960, their only son, Theo Matthew, was born. Their family was complete. Gypsy House became a noisy, creative, and joyful haven. In the garden, in a small brick hut, Roald wrote, creating the fantastical worlds that would soon make him famous. He would test his stories on his own children, gauging their reactions, shaping his tales around their laughter and their fears. It was in this period that he wrote James and the Giant Peach and began the story that would become Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. For Patricia, after the heartbreak and chaos of her early 20s, it seemed she had finally found her happy ending. But fate had not finished with Patricia Neal. The greatest and most terrible storms were still gathering, just beyond the horizon. The first blow fell on a cold winter's day in New York in December 1960. The family was in the city where Patricia was working on a film. 4-month-old Theo was in his pram, being pushed across the street by his nanny. A taxi cab, its driver distracted, sped through an intersection and crashed violently into the pram, sending the carriage and the infant flying through the air. Theo was thrown into the side of a bus. His skull was shattered in 9 places. It was a living nightmare, a parent's worst possible fear realized in a screech of tires and shattering glass. Theo was rushed to the hospital, barely alive. He survived the initial trauma, but the accident had left him with acute hydrocephalus, a terrifying condition colloquially known as water on the brain. The passages that allowed cerebrospinal fluid to drain from his brain had been blocked by blood from the injury. The fluid began to build up, causing his head to swell and placing immense crushing pressure on his developing brain. The prognosis was grim. The standard treatment was to surgically implant a shunt, a small tube and valve, to drain the excess fluid. But the technology was primitive. The valves, made of plastic, were notoriously unreliable. They would frequently clog with debris, requiring another agonizing, high-risk brain surgery to clear or replace them. Theo endured 7 of these horrific operations. Each time the shunt failed, he would scream in pain, his eyes would roll back in his head, and he would begin to go blind. It was a cycle of hope and despair, a living hell for his parents who kept a constant vigil by his hospital bed. But in the face of this medical horror, something extraordinary, something uniquely Dahl-esque happened. Roald Dahl, the cynical writer of dark tales, transformed into a relentless, obsessive, and brilliant inventor. He was furious at the failures of the existing medical technology. He refused to sit by and watch his son suffer and potentially die because of a faulty piece of plastic. He began to study the intricate mechanics of neurosurgery, reading every medical text he could find. He grilled Theo's gifted neurosurgeon, Dr. Kenneth Till, about the precise engineering flaws of the shunts. Then he reached out to a friend, Stanley Wade, a brilliant hydraulic engineer who happened to be a toy maker and model aircraft enthusiast. Together, These three unlikely collaborators, the writer, the surgeon, and the toy maker, set out to build a better mousetrap. Working in Wade's workshop, they designed and built a new, more effective cerebral shunt. The device, which would become known as the Wade Dahl Till valve, was a revolutionary piece of medical engineering. It was smaller, more reliable, and because it used two metal discs to create a slit-like opening, it was far less prone to clogging. The invention worked. It was implanted in Theo, and his condition finally stabilized. The WDT valve went on to be used to treat thousands of children with hydrocephalus around the world, saving countless lives and marking a major step forward in pediatric neurosurgery. Roald Dahl's fierce, almost brutal determination had not only saved his son, but had also given hope to an entire generation of families. It was a testament to his ferocious love for his children and a chilling preview of the obsessive, tyrannical force he would later bring to bear on Patricia herself. Just as the family was beginning to breathe again, just as Theo's future was starting to look brighter, tragedy struck again, this time with a swift and merciless finality that offered no chance for invention or intervention. In November 1962, their eldest daughter, the bright, witty, and deeply beloved 7-year-old Olivia, came home from school with a fever and a few spots. It was measles, a common childhood illness that nearly every child in that pre-vaccine era contracted. There was no cause for alarm, but Olivia's case was different. Her condition rapidly deteriorated. She became delirious, then began to suffer convulsions. The common virus had, through a cruel twist of fate, developed into measles encephalitis, a rare and devastating swelling of the brain. She was rushed to the hospital. Roald and Patricia kept a desperate, sleepless vigil by her bedside, but there was nothing anyone could do. Within days, she lost consciousness. In a rare, raw piece of writing about that night, Roald Dahl described the utter helplessness of the moment. I sat on her bed and held her hand. Her breathing became slower and slower. Then it stopped. Olivia was gone. The loss was absolute, an abyss of grief that consumed them both. Dahl, who had been able to fight ataxia and a medical condition, was powerless against a virus. He was shattered. In the years to come, he would become a passionate, almost fanatical advocate for measles vaccination, dedicating his most famous book, The BFG, to Olivia's memory. But privately, the death of his beloved daughter broke something in him. Their shared grief, which should have brought them closer, instead drove a profound and permanent wedge between them. In his anguish, Dahl grew cold and emotionally unreachable. He built a wall of ice around his heart and refused to speak of Olivia, as if her name itself was too painful to utter. Patricia, left to navigate her own sea of sorrow, was utterly alone. He couldn't talk about it. He just couldn't, she later recalled. He was so hurt. He was a very proud man, and he just couldn't face it. Their once joyful home became a house of sorrow, haunted by the ghost of their beautiful little girl. The fairy tale was well and truly over, replaced by a grim, silent chapter of unspoken grief. Patricia had thought that nothing ever could be worse than the death of her child. She was about to find out she was wrong. In the wake of Olivia's death, Great Gypsy House, once a chaotic sanctuary of creativity and laughter, became a museum of unspoken grief. The loss of a child is an unnatural disaster, a fissure in the fabric of a family that can never truly be repaired. For Patricia, the pain was a constant physical presence. She moved through her days in a fog of sorrow, trying to be a mother to her remaining children while her own heart was shattered. But it was Roald Dahl's reaction that plunged the home into a truly chilling silence. His grief was so immense, so absolute, that it became a fortress. He was constitutionally incapable of showing vulnerability. He locked his pain away in a deep internal vault and refused to speak of it, or of Olivia. Her name was banished from conversation. Her photographs were put away. He believed in his own rigid, brutal logic that the only way to survive the pain was to pretend it didn't exist. This emotional lockdown was a form of self-preservation for him. But for Patricia, it was a profound and lonely torture. She desperately needed to share her sorrow, to talk, to remember, to weep with her husband. But the man she turned to was a wall of ice. "Don't you see?" she once cried out to him in desperation. "If you've lost a child, you're in a club. And you can talk to another parent who's lost a child, and you want to." But Rold refused to join the club. He left her to grieve alone, a solitary mourner, in her own home. Patricia had believed that nothing could be worse than losing Olivia, but the agonizing loneliness that followed came terrifyingly close. In the face of this overwhelming personal darkness, Patricia Neal did the only thing she knew how to do. She went to work. She had always used her craft as a way to process the world, and now she used it as a shield, a distraction, a way to channel her unendurable pain into something tangible. And it was in this period, at the absolute nadir of her personal life, that she would be offered the role that would lead to the greatest artistic triumph of her career. The film was called HUD, and it was released in 1963. It was a stark modern Western, a story about the decay of the old American frontier values. She was cast opposite Paul Newman, who at the peak of his electrifying beauty and talent played the title character, a charismatic, amoral, and utterly soulless ranch hand. Patricia's role was Alma Brown, the world-weary, seen-it-all housekeeper. It was not a glamorous part. Alma was a working woman, a woman of a certain age, her face and spirit etched with the disappointments of a hard life. She was a character who exuded a quiet, unyielding dignity in a world of careless, destructive men. For Patricia, the role was not a stretch, it was a reflection. She didn't need to act the part of a woman who had been wounded by life. She was that woman. She poured all of her own pain, her disillusionment, and her hard-won resilience into Alma. When you watch her performance, you are not seeing an actress pretending. You are seeing a human being bearing her soul. The deep, husky voice now laden with an authentic weariness. The eyes that held a universe of unspoken sorrow. It was all there, raw and unfiltered. Her performance was a masterpiece of subtlety and quiet strength. It was real. The world recognized it as such. The critics raved. And in the spring of 1964, the ultimate professional vindication arrived. Patricia Neal won the Academy Award for Best Actress. It was a staggering moment. The girl from Kentucky, the young starlet who had been chewed up and spat out by the Hollywood system after the Cooper affair, the grieving mother who had just buried her child, was now standing on the world's biggest stage, holding its highest honor. She was at the absolute pinnacle of her profession, a respected artist at the peak of her powers. It was a triumph that seemed to promise a new, brighter chapter, and then a further blessing. In late 1964, while she was preparing to start work on a new film, 7 Women, to be directed by the legendary John Ford, she discovered she was pregnant again. After so much death, here was the promise of new life. The news was a ray of pure, unadulterated light in the lingering darkness. She and Rold were ecstatic. This child, they felt, would be a healing baby, a symbol of hope and a chance to rebuild their fractured family. Patricia Neal, at 39 years old, had it all. She was an Oscar-winning actress, a respected artist, a wife, a mother, and she was expecting her 5th child. She had weathered the most terrible storms imaginable and had emerged not just intact but stronger. more brilliant than ever. Then on the evening of February 17, 1965, the universe, in an act of almost unimaginable cruelty, decided to take it all away. She was at their rented home in California, where she was filming. It was early evening. She was in the bathroom, helping her 7-year-old daughter, Tessa, get ready for her bath. Roald was in the next room. Suddenly, she felt a strange sensation in the back of her head. In her autobiography, she would later describe it with chilling precision, a series of little explosions like firecrackers. This was followed by a searing, blinding pain that shot through her skull. She stumbled out of the bathroom, managed to say to Roald, "I'm sorry, I just feel so peculiar," and then she collapsed onto the floor, unconscious before she even hit the ground. At 39 years old, 5 months pregnant with her 5th child, Patricia Neal had suffered a series of 3 massive strokes in quick succession. She was rushed to UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. The diagnosis was catastrophic. A congenital aneurysm, a weak bulging spot on an artery wall in her brain, had ruptured, causing a massive subarachnoid hemorrhage. The bleed was so severe that it had triggered the subsequent strokes. She was in a deep coma. The pressure inside her skull was immense. Neurosurgeons performed a grueling 7-hour operation to clip the aneurysm and relieve the pressure, but the damage was already done. The prognosis was beyond grim. She remained in a coma for 3 weeks. The world's press held a morbid death watch outside the hospital. The doctors gave Roald almost no hope. They told him that, in the unlikely event she did survive, she would almost certainly be in a persistent vegetative state, or at the very least would be profoundly and permanently disabled. They advised him to prepare to place her in an institution for the rest of her life. Roald Dahl refused. In a moment that would define the rest of both of their lives, he looked at the doctors and rejected their prognosis. He would not let his wife die. He would not let her become a vegetable. He would bring her back. When she finally miraculously emerged from the coma, the extent of the damage was terrifyingly clear. The strokes had ravaged the left hemisphere of her brain. The right side of her body was almost completely paralyzed. She had lost most of the vision in her right eye. And most devastatingly of all for an actress, she had profound aphasia. The part of her brain that processed and produced language was, for all intents and purposes, gone. The woman whose magnificent, husky voice had captivated the world could no longer speak, read, or write. She could barely understand what was being said to her. She was trapped inside her own mind, a prisoner in a body that would not obey, with no words to express her terror. Roald had her flown back to England and brought her home to Great Gypsy House. And what followed was one of the most grueling, controversial, and ultimately miraculous rehabilitation programs ever undertaken. Dahl, the man who had co-invented a medical valve to save his son, now applied the same relentless, obsessive, almost inhuman energy to saving his wife. He became her general, her tyrant, and her lifeline. He rejected the gentle, passive approach to stroke therapy that was common at the time. He believed that the brain, like a muscle, could be retrained through relentless, brutal repetition. He devised a punishing, round-the-clock schedule that started at dawn and ended late at night. He became, in his own words, a benevolent dictator. He recruited an army of volunteers from their village, friends, neighbors, family, and assigned them shifts. This was Team Pat. Their mission was to work with her, talk to her, stimulate her from morning until night. There was absolutely no room for self-pity. The methods were unorthodox, and by any modern standard, psychologically cruel. If she couldn't remember the word for cup, She wasn't allowed a drink of water. If she struggled to form a word, he would yell at her, his frustration echoing through the house. "Oh, come on, Pat. Think, you know the word." He bullied her, cajoled her, and pushed her far beyond what anyone, including her doctors, thought was possible. To a friend who questioned his harshness, he famously retorted, "I'm a bastard. I have to be a bastard to get her well." For Patricia, it was a living hell. She was trapped inside her own mind, consumed by a fog of confusion and a storm of frustration. She fought back with silent, impotent fury. She resented his cruelty, his relentless demands, his refusal to show her any tenderness. But a deep, primal part of her also knew he was her only hope. He was a life raft in a terrifying ocean, even if the raft itself was made of thorns. And then, in the midst of this agonizing battle, another miracle. On August 4th, 1965, Patricia gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby girl, Lucy Neal Doll. The birth itself was a high-risk ordeal, but the baby was a symbol of impossible life emerging from the wreckage. The event seemed to spark something in Patricia, a renewed will to live not just for herself, but for this new child who needed her. Slowly, painstakingly, like a climber inching her way up a sheer cliff face, she began to claw her way back. The first word she managed to speak was a curse word, hurled at Rold in a moment of pure frustration. He was ecstatic. It was a start. She relearned the alphabet with her children's building blocks. She relearned how to form words, how to read a sentence, how to write her own name. She relearned how to walk, her right leg dragging behind her. It was a torturous, humiliating, and heroic process. Her progress was astonishing, defying all medical expectations. The thoroughbred was, against all odds, getting back on her feet. But while she was fighting the most public battle of her life, a quiet, private betrayal was taking root under her own roof. A tragedy that would prove to be the most painful and insidious wound of all. The story of Patricia Neal's recovery was, in itself, a masterpiece of public relations, orchestrated by the ever-strategic Roald Dahl. He understood the power of a good narrative. He invited Life magazine into their home to document the struggle, and the resulting article, complete with striking photographs of her arduous therapy sessions, captivated the world. She was no longer just a movie star. She had been transformed into a symbol. In an era before 24-hour news cycles and social media, she became a global icon of survival, her story a modern-day medical miracle that offered a powerful, tangible message of hope to stroke victims and their families everywhere. But for Patricia, a symbol was not enough. To be seen as a courageous patient was one thing. To be seen as herself was another. Her very identity, the core of who she had been since she was a girl in Tennessee, was inextricably linked to her craft. She was an actress. It was not just what she did, it was who she was. And in the years following her strokes, as she painstakingly rebuilt her mind and body, a singular, seemingly impossible goal began to form in her mind. She had to act again. It was a desire that terrified those around her. How could a woman who still struggled to find the right words, whose memory was fragmented, and whose body was still partially paralyzed, possibly endure the immense pressures of a film set? The very idea seemed not just ambitious, but reckless. Yet for Patricia, it was an existential necessity. It was the only way to prove to the world, and more importantly, to herself, that the woman she had been was not gone forever, but was merely waiting to be reclaimed. The opportunity came in 1968, just 3 years after the strokes that had nearly killed her. She was offered a leading role in the film adaptation of the Pulitzer Prize-winning play, The Subject Was Roses. The role was that of Nettie Cleary, a bitter, resentful, and deeply unhappy wife and mother. in a dysfunctional Irish-American family. It was not a gentle, sympathetic part. It was a role that required an actress to plumb the depths of emotional turmoil, to deliver long, complex passages of dialogue, and to hold her own against two powerhouse co-stars. It was a Mount Everest of a role for any actress, let alone one who was, in many ways, still learning to speak again. The entire industry held its breath. The insurance company for the film was so nervous that they insisted a doctor be on set at all times. The production was a high-wire act, a public gamble on her recovery. The first day on set was a terrifying ordeal. The lights, the crew, the camera, the immense pressure, it all came rushing back. She was plagued by self-doubt, terrified that she would fail, that she would be unable to remember her lines, that she would humiliate herself and prove her critics right. But then something extraordinary happened. As she began to work, she found that while the technical aspects of her craft were a struggle, the emotional core was stronger than ever. All the pain, all the frustration, all the loss she had endured in her own life, she now poured into the character of Nettie. Her real-life struggle informed every frame. When her character struggled to express a feeling, the hesitation, the fumbling for words was not an actor's trick. It was real. This gave her performance a raw, almost unbearable power and vulnerability that no other actress could have possibly matched. She wasn't just playing a woman in pain, she was a woman in pain, transmuting her suffering into art. Her co-stars and the crew were in awe of her courage. Martin Sheen, who played her son, later recalled the experience with a sense of wonder. He described how she would struggle with a line in rehearsal, but when the cameras rolled, she would deliver it with a force and an honesty that was breathtaking. The comeback was no longer a question of if, but of how brilliantly. When the film was released, the world was astonished. Patricia Neal had not just returned, she had returned as an artist whose craft had been deepened and profoundly enriched by her suffering. The performance was a triumph. And in the spring of 1969, the ultimate validation came. She was nominated for another Academy Award for Best Actress. She didn't win that year, but it didn't matter. The nomination itself was the victory. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and had returned, not just as a survivor, but as one of the finest actresses of her generation. It remains to this day one of the single greatest comeback stories in the history of Hollywood. The world celebrated Patricia's miraculous recovery, seeing it as the triumphant final chapter in a story of love, devotion, and resilience. Roald Dahl was hailed as the heroic husband, the knight in shining armor who had, through sheer force of will, willed his wife back to health. They were a celebrity couple unlike any other. Their story a powerful and inspiring modern fairy tale. But behind the closed doors of Great Gypsy House, the story was far more complex and far darker. The strain of the past decade, the horror of Theo's accident, the abyss of Olivia's death, the relentless, grueling battle of Patricia's strokes had taken a terrible toll. The man who had saved her life had also inflicted deep and lasting emotional scars. His tyrannical methods, which had been so effective in her physical rehabilitation, had also been deeply wounding. Their marriage, once a passionate intellectual and romantic partnership, had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered. It had become a relationship between a patient and a caregiver, a project manager and his project. The passion and equality that had once defined them were gone, replaced by a complex cocktail of gratitude, resentment, and a deep shared weariness. And then came the final, most intimate, and most insidious betrayal. For years, Patricia had noticed a growing, almost familial closeness between Roald and one of her own best friends, Felicity Lissy Crosland. Lissy was a set designer who had been a friend of the family for years. After Patricia's strokes, she had become an indispensable part of their lives, moving into Gypsy House to help manage the household and care for the children. She was a trusted, comforting presence, a port in the storm. Patricia relied on her, confided in her, and loved her like a sister. But the closeness between Lissy and Rold was different. It was a quiet intimacy, a shared language of glances and inside jokes that subtly excluded Patricia. For years, she had dismissed her own nagging suspicions. How could she possibly suspect the two people she relied on most? She was still grappling with her own damaged mind, and she told herself she was being paranoid, that her brain was playing tricks on her. She trusted her husband, and she trusted her friend. The truth was far uglier and far more heartbreaking. Rold and Lissy had been having an affair for over a decade. It had begun in the late 1960s, around the time of Patricia's strokes. He had been deceiving her throughout her entire agonizing rehabilitation. While she was struggling to relearn the alphabet, while she was weeping in frustration at her inability to form a sentence, her husband and her best friend were finding solace in each other's arms. The betrayal was not a fleeting indiscretion. It was a parallel life, a long-term relationship conducted in secret, right under her own roof. The discovery was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a slow, soul-crushing realization that unfolded over years. There were too many late-night conversations, too many unexplained absences, too many moments of shared intimacy that she was not a part of. The deceit was a poison that had infected their entire lives, creating a hollow space at the center of their marriage. For years, even after she knew in her heart what was happening, she tried to hold her family together. She confronted Rold, but he denied it, or dismissed her concerns as the ramblings of a brain-damaged woman. She endured the humiliation, the heartbreak, and the loneliness, clinging to the hope that she could save her marriage, that she could keep her family intact. But the foundation of trust was gone, and the entire structure was crumbling. Finally, in 1983, after 30 years of a marriage that had contained both epic love and epic tragedy, the facade shattered completely. Roald Dahl left Patricia Neal to marry Lissy Crosland. When a devastated Patricia, now in her late 50s, asked him why, after everything they had been through, he could do this to her, his response was cold, cruel, and utterly unforgivable. He reportedly told her that his years with her, the years of caring for her, had been a life of no fun at all. It was the ultimate act of cruelty. After everything she had endured, the loss of a child, the near death of another, the strokes that had stolen her voice and her body, the man who had been her partner through it all, the man who had quite literally saved her life, now abandoned her. It was a heartbreak that, in some ways, was more profound than any of the spectacular tragedies that had come before. This wasn't an act of God or a cruel twist of fate. This was a deliberate, calculated act of human betrayal, delivered by the person she had trusted most. For many, this would have been the final, crushing blow, a descent into a bitterness from which there is no return. But Patricia Neal's story was not destined to end in bitterness. The final act of her life would not be about the pain she endured, but about the grace she would choose to find in its wake. But Patricia Neal was not like most people. The same ferocious will that had allowed her to relearn how to walk and talk now turned inward. She had to learn how to live again, not just physically, but emotionally. She left Great Gypsy House, the home that held both her most cherished memories and her most painful ghosts, and returned to America, eventually settling in a home on Martha's Vineyard. She continued to act, finding solace and purpose in her work, taking on roles in television and film that celebrated the strength and complexity of older women. She became a doting grandmother, showering her children's children with the uncomplicated affection she had so often craved. The anger and bitterness towards Roald were there, a righteous fire that burned for years. But as time passed, something remarkable began to happen. She chose grace over grievance. For the sake of their shared children and grandchildren, she and Roald forged a fragile, careful friendship. And in a final, extraordinary act of forgiveness, she even became friends with Lissy, the woman who had taken her husband. She refused to let betrayal be the final word in her story. Shortly before Dahl's death from cancer in 1990, he wrote her a letter, a final poignant acknowledgement of the pain he had caused and the deep, complicated love that had once bound them. He wrote simply, "I'm just on my way to bed, and I just wanted to say I love you." It was an apology that had been decades in the making. Patricia's ability to forgive was perhaps her greatest and most difficult victory of all. It was the ultimate proof that her spirit, though battered and bruised, could not be broken. To look at the life of Patricia Neal is to see a timeline of almost unimaginable loss. But to truly understand her is to look beyond the headlines and into the small human moments that reveal the depth of her spirit. Think of the young actress, desperately in love, being told by the most famous man in the world that their child could not exist. The choice was not hers. It was a decision made for her, a wound she would carry in secret for decades. In a time when such things were never spoken of, she bore the grief and the guilt in silence, a profound loneliness that shaped the rest of her life. Consider the mother, sitting by the hospital bed of her 7-year-old daughter, watching her slip away from a disease that was supposed to be a harmless rite of passage. Roald Dahl, in a rare, raw piece of writing about Olivia's death, described the utter helplessness of the moment. "I sat on her bed and held her hand. Her breathing became slower and slower. Then it stopped." For Patricia, the silence that followed that last breath was a sound that would echo forever. And then there is the story of her rehabilitation. The public saw the triumph, but Patricia lived the daily humiliation. She once recounted how, in the early days, she saw herself in a mirror and was so horrified by the slack, unfamiliar face staring back that she didn't recognize it as her own. She called the strange woman in the reflection the three-headed woman. The struggle to reclaim her own identity was as arduous as the struggle to relearn to speak. When she finally managed to say a full sentence, the words were simple, but the meaning was profound. Looking at her new baby Lucy, she said, "I have a new little girl. I am a lucky woman." Even in the depths of her affliction, she could find a glimmer of gratitude. Her friend, the actress Maureen Stapleton, once visited her during her recovery. She saw the relentless drills, the exhaustion in Patricia's eyes, and the iron will of her husband. Stapleton said, "I've only known two geniuses in my life. One is Marlon Brando and the other is Pat Neal." It wasn't just Roald. Pat had a will that was just incredible. She willed herself back. But perhaps the most poignant story is the one that came after the betrayal. Forgiveness did not come easy. It was a long and painful process. Yet, in her later years, she found that peace. Her ability to forgive, to choose grace over grievance, was perhaps her greatest victory of all. It was the ultimate proof that her spirit, though battered and bruised, could not be broken. The story of Patricia Neal is complex, centering on the controversial role of Roald Dahl in her recovery. Was he a savior or a tyrant? On one hand, Dahl pioneered intensive home-based therapy, decades ahead of contemporary medicine. He refused to accept the doctor's pessimistic prognosis, and his iron will is what enabled Patricia to speak and walk again, saving her life. On the other hand, his methods were incredibly cruel. He yelled withheld affection and treated her without empathy, which some considered emotional abuse. His motives may have been both selfless and selfish, as he tried to rebuild the wife he had lost. Patricia herself was conflicted. She admitted she owed him my life, but also called him very, very cruel. Their story raises difficult questions about the line between tough love and brutality. Another controversy was her early affair with Gary Cooper. Viewed through a modern lens, this was a clear power imbalance within the old studio system. The pressure on her to terminate her pregnancy was not just personal, but institutional, exposing the exploitative dark side of the golden age. Patricia Neal's legacy extends far beyond Hollywood. In medicine, she became a symbol of hope for stroke survivors, changing public perception of the condition. The Patricia Neal Rehabilitation Center is a living testament to that legacy. Culturally, she is the archetype of the survivor, a story of resilience overcoming tragedy, unlike other tragic stars. Artistically, the suffering she endured brought astonishing depth to her later performances. Finally, her complex marriage to Dahl remains relevant as a profound study of love, betrayal, and the terrible burden that tragedy places on a relationship. Patricia Neal's life was a symphony of contradictions. She was a wife saved and betrayed by the same man, a mother who lost one child and nearly lost another, an actress who was stripped of her tools, mind, body, and voice, and fought to reclaim them all. Her story ultimately is not about tragedy, but about her response to it. It is a refusal to be defined by loss. She transformed her suffering into a source of hope for others, and that legacy of indomitable courage will never fade.